Welcome to Wadsworth History on Film, a program presented by the Wadsworth Area Historical Society and designed to record the oral history of Wadsworth for posterity. I'm Cesar Carino, your host, and our guest today is Charlie Aukerman. Charlie, you probably, as a newspaper editor, and you have been one for a long time, are one of the most elusive people in Wadsworth, yet you're probably one of the most powerful influences. And the reason I say that is that we typically look at newspaper editors as being that piece of paper we look in front of us when we're reading, and your name appears, and you're someone out there who doesn't really exist, but you do exist. Not only do you exist in person as you are here, but you also exist as a television personality of your own. You're on 2 or 3 shows that I know of, and you're heavily involved with Wadsworth activities. And you're a history buff, and you just have all kinds of things. And we are going to spend every precious moment today trying to find out a little bit about Charlie Aukerman. Since we have already established the fact that you exist, and here you are, could you tell us when you began existing and where you began existing?
Okay, I was born in July 30th in 1939, so I get to count World War II as part of the things that I've lived through. I was born actually in Lodi. My parents were both from Burbank, which is just west of town here, and then they lived in Elyria, but I was born in Lodi because that was where Mom was from, and the hospital, and my doctor, for my early years at least, was a Lodi doctor by the name of Whitaker, who founded the Lodi Hospital.
Dr. Whitaker.
He and his wife were both physicians in Lodi, and that had been Mom's physician, and that's why I was born there. When I was in Elyria as a young child, and right up through the time that I left Elyria, which was in 1960, when my father died, my doctor was a man named Stan Birkbeck. Now, the older residents of Wadsworth may remember Stan Birkbeck. Sure, he graduated here in the early 1920s or late 1918s, I'm not sure. And so I have a Wadsworth connection that way, although I never knew it until we took him into the Sports Hall of Fame a few years ago, and just shortly after he had died. He was inducted posthumously into the Hall of Fame, and that was kind of interesting that there is the connection, that I came to Wadsworth and he had gone to Elyria to work and live at that point.
We might be talking about Dr. Birkbeck here in a few minutes, because there are some relatives still in Wadsworth that he has. There are several Birkbeck families, but we will talk about him.
Sure.
But your father, of course, is gone now. But who was Dad?
All right, my father was named Ira Leo Aukerman. My mother was Beulah Marcine Packard. There was a gap in the age between the two. My father was born in 1899. My mother in 1918, and. Unfortunately, my mother died very young. She died at 37, the age of 37, when I was still in high school.
She died before your father?
And she died of Hodgkin's disease, which now you can more or less control, but in those days, nobody knew what to do about it.
No. And your mother was born in Lodi, did you say?
Yeah, she was there. Her family, her sisters and brothers, those who are still surviving, pretty much live in Burbank yet. Now, there's one brother that lives out in Arizona. And she was it's odd today because we think in terms of kids, but when I grew up, she never worked. She didn't work during World War II or anything like that. She just stayed home and raised me. She died, as I said, when I was in high school. Then my father died 5 years later at the age of 60. He had a heart attack, and on Christmas Eve, in fact, and we finally he died about a month later in the hospital in Elyria. So.
What about siblings, Charlie?
No other family.
You are it.
I am it.
You are it.
I am the last of the Aukermans.
Last of the Aukermans. And we're spelling the Aukermans Aukerman.
Right.
And we want to identify that only for the historical evidence here that we need.
There is kind of something kind of interesting because of the uniqueness of this situation. I keep referring to this when I'm talking to my cousins and so forth. I am the second oldest of my cousins, on my mother's side. But I'm the second youngest on my father's side.
Oh.
There's only one younger cousin than I am on my father's side. And most of my father's side cousins I never knew, because they were all adults before I was ever born. and they were all working, they had their own families, they'd moved away.
Well, Charlie, you won't say this about yourself, but I'll say it for you. This is the only time that you came in second for anything. You're
I don't know about that. I don't know about
top
that.
on everything that you do. And we want to get to your editorial skills in a little while, but how about growing up? You were born 2 years before the war began, the Second World War began. Probably don't remember a whole lot about it, but I would be interested in knowing, since you're so introspective, interesting knowing your feelings about the war at a very, very young age. And then I'll tell you why I'm interested.
Okay, there are some things that I remember about the war, which, and I talk about these sometimes when I talk to high school students. I remember the rationing that we had during the war.
You remember that?
I remember blackouts.
And you remember blackouts.
Which were probably the dumbest things in the world we had to undergo, in the sense that, you know, there wasn't any chance in Elyria that the German plane was ever going to reach there and bomb us. But it was, I think it was, and we talked about this on a show, your wife and I and Joe Gaines and so forth one time, about it was a way of drawing people together. There were things that united us in that war. Right. The one thing I do not remember, and I don't know why I don't, but I don't remember the day Roosevelt died.
Oh, you don't? I remember that as if it were yesterday.
That I don't recall, and yet I would have been 6 years old.
I can remember the kind of day it was in April, as you know. Mm-hmm. And it was one of those warm, cloudy days, and the humidity was high. And when he died, all the neighbors, of course, radio was the only thing that we had, and many people didn't have radios, truthfully. But they did know this, and the news began to spread, and people began to, because Roosevelt had been there forever. Well, 1932, 1933 he started. He had been there forever, and I do remember that. The reason I asked the question is that my wife was born shortly after you were, and what she remembers throughout the entire war was being afraid every morning when she woke up that her dad was going to be called to the service.
See, my father was out of that, and the irony of this is he was too young for World War I and too old for World War II, because of the way it worked out. And now on his side of the family, I don't think there were any of his brothers that ever had to go into a service either, for the same reason, unless, no, there wasn't any in World War I that I can remember. My mother's side of the family, now she had two younger brothers who caught the tail end of the war, but never they wound up overseas, but after we had liberated the areas they were involved in. So I did lose a cousin in the Korean War, on my father's side, who was killed in Korea. And, you know, and you do remember, if, you know, the rationing thing probably didn't hit me as much when I was real young, but it hit me right after the war. We were still in the rationing period when you could only get gasoline at certain times, and we had the stamps and we had the little tokens that you would take into the grocery stores, and you could only buy so much meat and so forth.
Soap.
And you know, it went right through, actually, into the Korean War. We even had some rationing during that.
Mm-hmm. I really am surprised that you remember that rationing, because that's a concept that small children typically don't. But then you've never been normal in anything, have you, Charlie?
No, probably not.
I mean that with all affection, as you well know. Charlie,
I have a special interest in kids who I perceive to be somewhat like me when I was younger. So
well, and we'd like to hear about you when you were younger. Tell us about your elementary school days, and were you the same kind of person then as you are now? Very verbal, and which is a compliment. Also very bright, historically oriented, and a person who could remember things, little details that no one else can remember. Was that what you were like when you were growing up?
Yes and no. It's you know, the interesting thing about it, I went through 3 schools. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this. I know that Linda is aware of this, but I do not have a high school diploma.
I do know that,
okay.
Yes. And
I have a master's degree, but I don't have a high school diploma.
I was going to bring that up because I wanted to hear people, and I'll tell you a little story about having a master's degree and not having a high school diploma, but go ahead.
But I went through Hamilton Elementary School and then Franklin Junior High, and then Elyria High School for 3 years. And actually, I never had any problems in school as far as academics were concerned. I was never a great athlete. Although I did play junior high basketball. I think everybody did play something at one time or another. But academically, I was fortunate enough that I had the ability to pretty much read and remember everything that I read remember it.
And you've read everything that there is to read.
Well, I don't think I've done that. I've got a library of about 4,000 books that I haven't even looked at yet. But you're kind of fortunate if you're able to do that, and I was able to do that pretty much. And I had friends of mine who I just couldn't understand sometimes why they couldn't get something as easily as I did. And that went all the way through the junior high, or the elementary school, went right through the junior high. And I'll tell you a little quick story about the junior high, because it's kind of typical of the way I felt and what happened to me when I got into high school, when I got bored. But in junior high, because they hadn't built the new building, our new building was not open yet and not ready yet, Franklin's new elementary school. Hamilton and Eastern Heights, kids that were going to go to Franklin and Eastern Heights junior high schools, were put together in Wadsworth, in Elyria High School, in one building, the oldest building, which was called the Washington Building, which was on Middle Avenue. And we were there, and we had all of our classes there, and then we went to the cafeteria for lunch and so forth. That's the only time that I never had to go home, or we were not permitted to go home for lunch. Other times, we didn't have lunchrooms. There were no lunchrooms in the elementary schools. There were none in the junior highs, and you just went home for lunch and then came back. You had a period of about an hour and a half to do it. Well, anyway, I'm in this junior high, and we had to pack a lunch, because I don't know if we were really allowed in the lunchroom. If we were, it was some weird hour. But we're there, and I'm taking seventh grade math. And we're in the seventh grade math class, and whoever the teacher was a man named Withrow, I remember that. And he later became a reporter for the Elyria Chronicle Telegram. But the thing that I remember the most about this is that we were like 20 pages from the end of the book by February. Because his method of teaching was, you all know how to do this problem? If not, we'll do some on the board. So they'd do some problems on the board. Students in the class would do some problems on the board. It would be done. Be over with. And we'd go to the next page, and then we had our homework and so forth on the next page. Well, I get back to when we get into February, we get into our new building, I don't have this guy anymore. He goes to Eastern Heights. So I wind up with a lady who was a very nice English teacher, math teacher. She was on page 80 in that book.
And you were already...
And we'd already passed that before Christmas.
Right.
And so I said, this isn't fair. I said something, the other guy wasn't supposed to be that far. Well, I had asked him what would happen if we ever got done with that book. And he said, well, we're going to start doing some algebra, which I was all gung-ho about doing at the 7th grade level. And then I go back and I have to do all that stuff over again. And she, of course, didn't teach the same way he did. So we had all this homework, this stuff to do in study halls and things like that. And frankly, it bored the hell out of me. Sorry for the language, but that's basically what happened. And basically, that's what happened in high school. I zipped through the freshman year with no problem. I zipped through the sophomore year with no problem. I was zipping through the English third year, but I was getting very bored. I did get very bored, and I started to get into problems with students who weren't there at that level. And frankly, it boiled down to my going into the Dean of Boys' office one day and saying, you better get me out of here, because there's going to be problems if you don't. And eventually they got tired enough of hearing me that they sent me to I don't know what they call it. They call it Children's Services now, but anyway, they had me psychologically tested. And the first thing the guy did after taking the test was, we're going to get you out of there before they ruin your mind completely. And that was the end of my high school career. Well, now I've got,
But you went on to college.
I didn't go on to college right away. I was 22 before I went on to college. But see, my father had his heart attack, and I had to start working. And I was fortunate enough that Dad had a friend in the newspaper. I had actually obtained a part-time job at the Elyria Chronicle Telegram in my junior year, and so I was able to work there. And Dad no longer could work because he'd had his first heart attack, which was like 57, 58, and so more or less I worked for the next couple of years while he did not. And and when he died, it was still another year after, well, it was 2 years after he died, because I went in '62. to the University of Michigan. I went to the University of Michigan, who admitted me on the basis of test scores and on the basis of their own tests, which they gave themselves. They also admitted me as an in-state student, for which I'm forever grateful, because it knocked about $1,000 off the tuition. And from there, then I wound up at Kent State eventually because I ran out of money up there and had to come back, and I worked for 5 more years before going on back and getting the rest of the degree.
The rest of the degree. The reason I was interested in that story is that these kinds of things do happen. When I was dean of the evening college at the University of Akron, a man came in to me one afternoon. He said, I own my own accounting firm. I never graduated from high school, and everyone in my firm, 75 people, are all certified public accountants. I own the place, and no one knows that I don't have a high school diploma. What can I do? Can I get into the university? The answer is yes. The state does permit you to go to the university even though you don't have a high school diploma. There's no requirement for that. Now, obviously it helps. The success story is that this man started that day. He owned his own company in a suburb of Cleveland. I won't say exactly where it is. He ran 75 people, ran a very, very good business, a very profitable business. He came to school every single night, and in 4 years later, he graduated from the University of Akron with a 4.0 IQ.
Good.
Now, that's the kind of story that we like to hear. It's that kind of drive. Charlie, we're going to be spending not too much time, because there's no such thing as too much time here, but if we give you free reign, you might talk. I'm not sure.
Talk forever, right.
So we have to get into some of these
I do want to point something out.
Okay,
I tell kids not to do that, to go through high school if they at all possibly can. I know kids get bored in high school. I'm watching a cousin of mine right now who I see a lot of myself in her, and she just entered high school, and I'm doing everything I can to help her cope with what I can see happening. But but things are different. There's a lot more options for kids today.
True, and that's right.
There's a lot more electives to take, which we didn't have, and it's a lot different. So the times were different. And sometimes for necessity, there is a downside too. You lose social contact with people.
Very important aspect of it, surely. And it's also that you take a place like Wadsworth High School, where they have all of the opportunities for a person to get advanced placement and all of that. There's no such thing as being bored in a high school such as Wadsworth anymore. Charlie, we spent 18 minutes on your birth. Now, I knew fully well that when I began interviewing you that I would have to push you, because you are so ungodly interesting that you would keep on, and this is great. But let me tell you that we have 3 major things to cover. First and foremost, we would like to cover what you did then in your lifetime from age 1 to, let's say, 25 or so, when you got your master's degree. Right. Then you became involved with the newspaper, where?
Okay, I started out at the Elyria Chronicle Telegram, where I worked until 1961, from about 55 to 61. And then I left that for a while and went to college. As I mentioned, I was up in Michigan for 2 years. Then I came back, worked at a office supply store in Worcester for a while, wound up at the New Philadelphia Times for 3 months, and then went to the Elyria Chronicle had bought the Medina Gazette. So from 1965, January 65, I was at the Gazette. I taught school in 67, 68, and worked at the Gazette part-time.
And what did you teach?
I taught social studies in Smithville, 6th and 7th grade.
Who was your superintendent at the time?
A man named Thornton McKay. He was before Dick Holmes.
Before Dick Holmes.
Yeah.
Dick Holmes is one of our Wadsworth people.
Right. Dick came there right as Thornton retired.
As Thornton retired. So you then went from the Elyria Chronicle, or the Medina County Gazette, to the Wadsworth
Right. After I left teaching, which, as I said, I taught 1 year. I went back to school. I was back to school while I was teaching. And then I took about 3 months off, and then I came here in November 1968.
In the Wadsworth News Banner at the time.
Now, I had known John Miller. I had applied here one time before with John. And at that time, he didn't have an opening. At one time, he did have an opening, but I had just been promoted at the Gazette, so I didn't stay. But I came back down here to write sports, and then City, and eventually City and school.
Right. So the second item that we're going to try to be talking about today is the history, as it were, of what is now the Sun Banner Times, but was the Wadsworth News Banner, and before that was the Banner Press and the Wadsworth News, and going all the way back to Nellie Harder, and you do have some information about Nellie Harder. Starting from where you began, who were the people who were involved at that time? John Miller you mentioned. What about Red?
Okay, the key people at this News Banner when I joined the paper, John Miller was the editor, Sue Morrison did the women's news and helped work on the office. John's first wife, Lucille, worked the office. Joe Klosterman was a photographer and reporter, and Red Smith was the key advertising person.
What's Red Smith's real name?
Horace.
Horace Smith.
Right.
I just want to get that in because we know that, but we want to make sure that people in 2014 will know that. When you write the history.
When I write the history.
Because
well,
you're the person.
I'd like to be alive then. That's the key.
We are hoping that you do write the history because you'll do a phenomenal job, and we're hoping that these 70 or 80 or 90 tapes that we have from Wadsworth History on Film will help you.
Okay, I appreciate that. Then in our production department in those days were two people. Two key people, Tony Malici and Howard Lightfoot.
And they were in the printing part.
They were the printing part, although no longer did we actually print the paper there because that had been taken over in Gow Printing.
Right.
And then we had a couple of typesetters, Nancy Hall, and we had some other people. Helen Larridge came in and worked out part-time, actually doing production work. Nancy Hall was doing production work. I'm trying to think, there were some others that Eileen, I can't think of Eileen's last name. They no longer live here in town. But we had, there was a Mrs. Hannah whose husband wound up at Evanston, Illinois, working for the College of Evanston. So we had some people like that who were working part-time doing things. But the key people in there were the ones I mentioned. That, you know.
Now, starting there again, Tony Malici was one of the ones who was doing the linotype.
Right.
Tell us what we did with linotype machines after computers came in.
Okay, actually, Tony never wound up in the computer age. Linotype machines were how, of course, we first put papers together. You typed it. You had a typesetter who sat and had to type on a special keyboard, and that put out a line of actual lead type, and then the lead type was read. It was upside down and backwards. You had to learn how to read everything upside down and backwards. Then you put that together and put the paper together. But the computer, the linotype, was done away with first by computers in which you typed, and it wound up on a piece of paper. And you took the paper and you pasted it down on a form, and then that paper was shot, or that picture that was taken, and that picture was used to make the plate that actually ran the press off. Now we have come into the full computer age, in which we now type on a computer. We send the story to our main production facility by modem over the phone lines. No one ever touches anything. The final product comes right off of the computer. You can actually do your page on the computer, edit your copy on the computer. It's probably cost a lot of jobs because you don't have proofreaders anymore. You're pretty much responsible for being your own proofreader. You're pretty much also you're responsible for writing and doing all the typing, of course. And the only thing that an editor may do today, besides change some of the words in the story and smooth it out, is put a headline on it. And then we get a sheet of paper that's about this size every Tuesday, and it has a diagram of the page on with all the ads in place, and then we just draw the picture on that page and where we want the story to go. And they just put a number on it, and they just call the number up on their computers and do it. I have to go once every so often. We have a floor editor in Cleveland, and this month in October I have to go twice up to Cleveland because he'll be on vacation, so that I will do the floor editing on the floor, and I will actually physically see the paper develop that way. Normally you don't even do that anymore.
So we have no more linotype machines.
No more linotype machines. When I came
no more
to the
printing
News Banner,
presses.
well, we have printing presses, but we don't here in Wadsworth. But they're not the same kind of printing presses either. They're pretty much offset presses, which means that you have an aluminum plate rather than a solid lead plate that you're working with. And I remember working at the Elyria Chronicle when if you didn't fasten those plates down, those lead plates, you could ruin your entire press. And a couple times those plates went flying off and people were ducking lead all over the place.
I would imagine.
It was much more dangerous in those days than it is today.
It's actually not lead, it's a combination of lead and something else.
Yeah, some other.
Well, how about showing us a picture of what the type used to look like right there. This is an 1872 newspaper, and that's the type that it used to look like. And Charlie, just for a quick joke here, how about reading the story about Horace Greeley?
Okay, this is kind of interesting. The paper here, the newspapers in the 1800s were much more political than they are today. Or at least we make an objective or attempt to be objective. But in those days, you had usually a purely Republican paper and a purely Democratic paper, and the twain never saw eye to eye on anything else. In this particular paper, which I'm assuming was in Enterprise, the Wadsworth Enterprise, I don't know what side they were on, but obviously they wanted U.S. Grant to win. So here's the comments on the National Democratic ticket for President Horace Greeley, for Vice President B. Kratz Brown, and you know, there'd be another name that would go down, everybody'd forget in history. Wendell Phillips's opinion of Grant now and then. Now, who Wendell Phillips is, I don't know, but Wendell Phillips is very decidedly in favor of Grant. Such service as his visionary, flighty brain may contribute is freely offered to secure the return of Ulysses to the White House for 4 years longer. We cannot doubt that Mr. Phillips is for Grant after reading the following language offered by him in a speech delivered at Lynn last Thursday. Long live Ulysses Grant. May he continue to be President of the United States until every white man over 40 years of age who lives south of Mason and Dixon's line has been forever put into the ground. Loud and continuous applause. In 1868, this was the opinion which Mr. Phillips entertained of Grant. It was expressed in a letter to the Anti-Slavery Standard. We have little confidence in Grant. The best thing about him is that he seems desirous to execute the nation's will. He is no traitor like Johnson, that would be President Andrew Johnson, who had followed Lincoln. Neither has he any statesmanlike comprehension of the hour. We fear he belongs more to Morgan, Conkling, and Howard, who were all senators and various politicians in Washington, than to Sumner and Wade, who were two other prominent people at the time. He was drunk in the public streets since the first day of January. This is a fact as patent as the sun at noonday. None but those too dishonest to be trusted with public journals, having passed themselves on for owls, deny it. They're very, very colorful.
I would say so. I would hate to have to be running a campaign in 1872 if that's what they would say about people. They can figure out anything bad. Now, at the Wadsworth News banner, when you first started, there was Nellie Harder in evidence.
Nellie wrote a column for us. She never came down to the office generally, and I personally never got a chance to meet Nellie. The column would be picked up by John at her home, which at that time was on Pardee Street.
But do you know some anecdotes about Nellie Harder?
Well, where our fire station stands apparently was the first house that she lived in Wadsworth. There are still some columns that she wrote. She was a very outspoken lady, particularly about politics in Wadsworth.
What were her politics, do we know?
I really don't know myself. It says in one of these papers that I've got here that...
We'd like to see a picture of her. Do you have a picture of Nellie?
I have one here someplace. It's not very good, but hopefully it will work out.
That's a good picture there. We can take a good look at that. She, at this time, was 90 years old. And this was on May 9th of 1976, so she must have been born in 1886.
Yeah, now she died that year too, so...
She died the same year.
Yeah, she was 90 when she died. But she started in the newspaper business in 1904 at the Wadsworth Banner Press, which at that time was owned by a man named Hostetler. And when Hostetler decided to retire, she bought him out, and she ran that paper until about, I believe, 1940... she took a quarter interest in the paper in 1922, and in 1944, the Banner Press was purchased by H.J. Hall to merge with the Wadsworth News, which he already owned.
And Wadsworth
that became the News Banner.
News Banner in 1944. Harry Jerry Hall owned the Wadsworth News, and the Wadsworth News at that time is where the alley is immediately next to the gas station on Broad Street.
Okay.
That
was the News or the Banner Press?
That was the Banner Press.
Banner Press was there on Broad Street, right.
Broad Street, the Banner Press, you're right, and the News was over on
Wautroosa
Avenue, and then they moved to Wautroosa completely. But the Banner Press was next to the saloon and 2 doors up from what is now the Strand Theater or the Marquee or whatever is there.
Right.
Just so that 2014, our 200th anniversary, people will know where that is. And then Jerry Hall bought that, but for 1904 to 1944, and that's 40 years, Nellie Harter did this. Nellie Harter was never married, was she?
No.
And she was an outspoken person. Read just a couple little things that Nellie Harter might have said or...
Well, there's some things here. In 1976, shortly before death, the plane dealer came down to write a story about her. And they headlined it at 90, Nellie still writes like 60 in Wadsworth, which was a very good story. The man named Richard Ellers did this, but Nellie did a couple of things. She won free mail for American servicemen in 35 years ago during World War II.
That was for the entire nation.
Was for the entire nation.
Yes, she won that from right here from Wadsworth, Ohio.
Right. This was a big push, a thing she wrote, and she started this she started people into writing their congressmen about doing this for the war. She is the only, there was a bicentennial plate in 1976 for the bicentennial, and she was the only living Wadsworth figure portrayed on that plate. Everyone else had passed on except for her. The servicemen's mail privilege was kind of lost in the shadow of a crusade. She got Wadsworth's bank reopened after 2 years of the Depression. Apparently the banks had all closed in Wadsworth, and she started a crusade to get one reopened here, and out of that came, as I understand it, what was the Citizens Bank.
Citizens Bank, that is correct.
Was reopened at that point. And she said this and told the reporter this: I got the feeling that there were all these people in Washington with free mail, but not for all the men we had in the service, even before we were at war. So I wrote an editorial about it. I wrote it like a letter. It started out, "Dear Uncle Sam." Well, clippings of this letter, an editorial, and letters from her readers poured into Washington, and Ohio congressmen picked up the campaign and got the free mail service for the servicemen. Then later on, before she did this in the 1960s, I believe it was, she wanted the Senior Citizens Hotel built in Wadsworth in the 1960s. Now that was a full 15 maybe years before we actually saw the first one built, which was Menoir here in town, which came about in the early 70s. And then Menoir led to the Wadsworth Towers, and now we have other assisted living like Liberty Residence and Alder Care and some other things. She was quite influential in the community, and obviously at least one time quite influential in the nation.
Yes, she was. That's right. So that's our Nellie Harter, right?
That was our Nellie Harter.
She, as you say, was very outspoken. Do you remember any stories at all about her having been so outspoken?
Only to the point, I wish, in a way, Joe Klosterman, who, knew her personally, would consent to do one of these shows.
Well, I've asked him, and he might yet.
He may yet, but he doesn't much care for a lot of publicity, I think, sometimes. There are a lot of little things, and I've got some clippings here about her. She was the head of the Red Cross for a while. She had a brother named Nathan W. Harter, who was a college professor at, Greenville, Pennsylvania. I'm not sure what college is. Thiel College.
Thiel College is in Greenville.
Yeah, and he was a professor of mathematics there. They named a dormitory after him.
I didn't realize that.
So there is a Harter dormitory for him. She was executive secretary, as I said, of the Wadsworth chapter of the Red Cross, and she took over that job in 1945 and did that through 1950. She was also instrumental in organizing Wadsworth's water safety program under the Red Cross.
With Mabel McCritchie.
Pardon?
With Mabel McCritchie.
Okay, I didn't know that who else was involved in that. And as I said, she lived on Lyman Street, apparently in the place which is now occupied by the fire station, because there's a 1963 article about plans for a new fire station got a shot in the arm this week with the announcement that the dispute over the Nellie Harter property on Lyman Street has been settled out of court, and it will become city property on May 15th. City Solicitor Charles Johnson said the city will pay $22,000 for the property, and said he was pleased the matter did not have to be taken into the courtroom. According to Safety Director William Hanscom, planning for early construction will begin immediately, and Hanscom reports that $68,000 was available for the construction of the station. Now, when I came to town in '68, she was living on Pardee Street in a residence on Pardee, so presumably in that 5 years, that's where she had moved to after.
Now, getting back to the news banner once again, Charlie,
Sure.
we have John Miller. Tell us who John Miller was and where John Miller is today.
Okay, well, John Miller, unfortunately, is no longer with us. I really wish he were, but
he was a tremendous man, and he would have been a tremendous asset to this program. But
yes, he would have. And he was born and raised in the Pittsburgh area. Came to college at the College of Worcester and served for a while as alumni secretary at the College of Worcester, I believe it was. He came up here and he came to town and fell in love with Wadsworth. He became the editor when H.J. Hall bought the paper. He had been briefly worked for the paper before. And I understand for a while he worked for the Ohio Match or Ohio Salt Company in some capacity in the front office. But he took the job as editor when H.J. Hall called him up and asked him to become the editor. And John wasn't sure he wanted to be, I understand, but he accepted Jerry's offer. And when H.J. Hall died, he became a part owner of the paper. There's a pretty good little bit of information on him. But John is kind of a, you talk about me being elusive, but John was a fascinating man to work for. He treated everyone like a family. That was one thing that when I first came to work here, he said, this is a family operation. And everyone here is a family. And we have one goal, and that is to produce a paper for Wadsworth, which we did. And everybody that worked in the paper worked and lived in Wadsworth. When he decided to retire, which was, he retired 2 years after he decided to sell the newspaper in '75, he called Joe and myself aside to the then Blue Onion and told us that he was selling the paper to Gow Printing in Medina, who would do right by everybody here, because he had been a friend of Neil Gow's, and Gow's had done the printing for the paper for some year, for almost a decade, in fact. And Neil did. It was enjoyable working for Neil. It was more enjoyable, I think, working for John. He's probably the best boss I ever had, and I've had some good bosses simply because of that family atmosphere that he fostered so well in the operation. There are little stories I could tell. There was a time that a businessman here in town went out and purchased Christmas lights for the downtown area through the then Chamber of Commerce, which is not the same Chamber of Commerce as exists today.
Right.
The older one. Well, the Chamber didn't have the money for it, so John paid the bill out of his pocket. And there were lots of little things like that. He established the H.J. Hall Grizzly Memorial Award for the high school. It had to be a football player or participated in one other sport. He established that, and that's a tradition that's still being carried on by the present ownership, because that was part of the deal. But John at one time even thought about funding that privately out of his own pocket if the papers didn't want to carry it on.
John's first wife died.
Yes, Lucille.
Lucille. Then he married.
Well, it's about the same time that Lucille passed away. Howard Lightfoot, who had just retired.
And who worked there at the
right. And when he passed away, John began to see his ex-wife, his wife, and love blossomed between them, and they got married.
Then he lived on Hartman Road.
They built a proper house on Hartman Road, which was on property that the Lightfoots had owned prior to that.
Right.
And the Lightfoots sold a piece of their property to the city for a park. I don't know how many people remember or know that, but there is a potential park out there about 10 acres worth.
That's right. That's exactly on the curve around Johnson Road. Now, some other people worked at the news banner at the time. You had mentioned Howard Lightfoot. What about Rosenblum? What was her first name?
Well, it was Sue Morrison that worked there.
Sue Morrison, but you mentioned her, and then we didn't mention one of the writers.
Well, I'm trying to think who that would be. I'm trying to remember who all.
How about Mrs. Brannigan?
Well, Joan Brannigan was at that time raising children when I first joined there, but she was contributing articles to the paper, but she was not actually working out of the office. She did not come back full time until Sue passed away. Now, Sue, I understand, had started out in advertising and switched over to editorial when Red was hired.
She was in advertising to begin with.
Right. And, of course, Red Smith was hired out of, off of the Millersburg paper, the Millersburg Times, I'm not sure what it's called anymore, Hub, I think it is. And he came up here from Millersburg with his wife, and they, of course, had 2 children. With them, John had 2 children. John and Lucille had 2 children. Ironically, all 4 were girls. Well, John had 3 children. He had a boy, Mike. Mike is currently living in Jacksonville, Florida, where he is a retired naval officer. Becky lives over in Greene, somewhere in that area, and the oldest girl lives out in Kansas City, I think it is right now.
Right. Now we have banner printing that used to be behind the news banner.
Right.
Bruce Brickell.
Right.
And how was that relationship established?
Okay, apparently that banner printing was part of the arrangement. If you remember, Caesar, the old weekly newspapers pretty much all had job shops associated with them. John didn't really want a job shop, so when he bought out the news banner, he sold the banner press, the job shop off to Bruce Brickell. And Bruce, I think, eventually took another, opened another one here in town, out on College Street.
Bruce Brickell is related here in Wadsworth.
Okay. When I came to town, it was owned by a man named Gantz, Don Gantz.
Don Gantz,
and, Miskell, but I can't think of Miskell's first name.
Miskell.
Miskell, yeah.
M-I-S-K-E-L-L.
Right.
Right.
Harold, was it Harold or Harold Miskell?
Howard,
maybe?
I think.
Howard Miskell. They owned it, and of course it's now owned by Gary Deem and Stu Minen, but it's across the street from the location where it was in our old building on Wautroosa. The old Wadsworth News Banner building is now the bicycle shop on Wautroosa.
Now, you worked at the paper in Medina, the Gazette. Denny Holsinger, ring a bell with you?
Right.
Denny Holsinger's wife is a sister to Bruce Brickell.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
I didn't know that.
I wanted to get that relationship in there. Now, we're going to run out of time, Charlie, and I knew we would, but we're going to run out of time. We're going to come back to this in a couple of minutes, but we need to hear about what you have done politically, what you have done personally, what you have done professionally here in Wadsworth. You're on, I said a while ago that you're on 2 television productions.
Yeah.
Tell us about those and tell us what you do with them and how they came about, and then tell us about what you've done as far as involving yourself with the community.
Okay, very briefly, there are 2 TV shows.
Now that's impossible.
No, right. Well, this is brief. The TV shows will be brief, Caesar. There are 2 TV shows. One is called Wadsworth Week in Review, which was really Bo Deuce's idea. He wanted to do a news show.
Who's Bo Deuce? Tell us.
All right, Bo Deuce is a teacher, history teacher at Norton, who writes city council and city news for us, and has been doing so for several years, simply because I didn't have enough time to continue doing this. We were working much over 40 hours a week, and I needed to cut back. But Bo put together this idea for the show. So we do the news show, and it's broadcast 4 times a night on Saturday nights on each hour. The other show is called Let's Talk, and Joe Gaines, and it was Joe Gaines and my idea basically to come up with some kind of a local talk show dealing with local issues, but they don't always turn out to be local. Your wife Linda is on it, and Bo is on it. From time to time, Sherrod Brown has dropped in, Colin Cranston has dropped in.
And you used to have Sharon...
and we used to have Sharon Ray as well, before she got too busy to be involved in this thing. We really wanted a show that would just deal with talking about things of concern to Wadsworth people or the nation or something of that nature. It started out, I think, supposedly the idea of being a kind of McLaughlin group debate thing. It hasn't really been that much of a debate, but there's a lot of good discussion, a lot of good talking about that. Those 2 shows I've been involved with. I've stayed pretty much when I came to town. Of course, my degrees are in political science at Kent, and so I have a natural interest in politics and city government in general. I guess I say now that I've spent 30 years studying the lowest level of city government, or the real low level government. Most high schools study the national government. Maybe you get a little state government, but you never really study the city you live in. or the county you live in. And critically, you know, really that's the area that affects you as a person the most, because that's the one that provides you with the services you need to continue, you know, to live the lifestyle you want to live. So I've been studying Wadsworth politics for a long, long time, and Wadsworth government for a long, long time. In 1977, I was asked if I would be interested in running for office. And I said I would, but only if, you know, there's always a natural conflict of interest idea behind the idea of a newspaper reporter being involved in local government. And I said, but only if they gave the power, you know, the people that owned the paper agreed. So apparently they did, because they allowed me to do so. And I served one term on council. Well, in the term that I served on council, the newspaper changed ownership, and the new ownership didn't agree to that. So pretty much I've stayed out of it. I have managed to, and this was not really planned, but when the cable TV was being started here in town, I was asked by Mayor Tom Cox at that time if I'd be interested in serving on the commission, which was 15 years ago.
And you are the first?
And I am the only current member that has been there all 15 years.
All 15 years.
Willard Houston has been on, was there at the original time, but then he left for a while and came back. Homer Baldwin and I were the last two holdouts, and now Homer's no longer on it. So the commission has changed. The circumstances, we were set up to do one thing. The national government never allowed us to do it because they promptly deregulated cable when we were supposed to be the ones determining rates and so forth. Then they re-regulated it, and before we could do that again, they deregulated it again. So basically that's the one political area that I'm still involved with as far as the city is concerned. I was on the Recreation Commission for 2 years as a representative of the school board. I was also, I'm a member of the Lions Club, and for a while I was in the officers' positions, but I haven't had time for that for many, many years, and unfortunately I haven't really time to devote to the Lions Club the time I should now. I get to meetings when I can, but it's not as often as it used to be. School-wise, I probably interfered more than anything else. I used to, when I first came to town, I was also a substitute teacher up here at the high school. So I would do some subbing at the high school level. And I got involved way back when, about 1970, 69 or 70, with the girls' sports program, which was just then being started. And Rex McIlvain, Judy Thompson, and Charlene, at that time was Charlene Severance, then she became Charlene Darst. And I went to the board, and we urged the board to start a girls program.
Tell us a little bit about Charlene Severance and something else you did.
Well, Charlene was the 1964 Wadsworth, Miss Wadsworth, 1964.
Right. And that was our 150th anniversary.
150th anniversary. She went to Slippery Rock University, came back here as a teacher, elementary. I think she started out at, I'm not sure if she ever actually got to the high school as a phys ed teacher, but she may have briefly. She married Paul Darst, who also taught here for a while. He went down to Ohio State to get his master's and his doctorate. He is now a professor of physical education at the Arizona State University, and they live in Tempe, Arizona.
Tempe, Arizona.
I haven't heard from them for a while. So Paul has written a history of Wadsworth football, which I'd like to get my hands on. And they have a couple children, I understand. Her parents moved out there. The last time I saw them, they were visiting her parents, but her parents subsequently moved out there. Now, she still has a sister, Carol, in town here, or a brother, maybe. I think Carol's, yeah, would be her brother lives in town. Carol is her sister-in-law. So, you know, there is that tie, and of course her niece was quite an athlete here a few years ago, Colleen. So
Colleen Severance?
Yeah, was quite an athlete here. But Charlene, we got the girls' sports program started here. Pretty much that's where I've stayed out of things. I think as a newspaper editor, you always influence a lot of things, or try to influence things. School levies particularly, financial levies, things that you're involved with like that. I've been asked a number of times to run for office again, and obviously if I'm still working, I'm not going to be doing so. I don't know. Maybe I'll go back into it after I retire. I'm not sure.
Well, you surely are a good one. There's no question about that. Charlie,
well, I'm not sure
tell us your day from morning till night. And the reason I'm asking that is that most people think that newspaper people editors particularly, sit behind a desk and point and say, do this and do that and so forth. Tell us what you have to do. You have to get up early in the morning and tell us what you do. Say, let's take a Friday.
Okay, like a Friday. Normally I'm out of bed somewhere about actually I may not be out of bed, but I'm up by around 4:45.
4:45. I wanted to hear you say that because I knew that. 4:45 in the morning.
And I get up, and since I'm into the martial arts, I go through my martial arts exercises first, and then I go get ready to go to work. I'm down at Mike's restaurant usually, which is where I normally eat breakfast at about 6:45.
And why do you go to Mike's restaurant? I mean, not.
Well, because that's really where the other people in the city come.
Okay, and what do you do at Mike's restaurant?
You've got the mayor, you've got the service director, the safety director come in, and we sit there at the round table and we hash over what's going on in the city and stuff. And you know, in fact, there was a couple things discussed this morning that at the moment I'm not at liberty to talk about. I don't even know all of the things. I'd like to find out some of the things I heard this morning. But
in other words, you get a lot of your news at the round table.
I get a lot of information at the round table, background if nothing else.
What kind of people sit at the round table? You said the mayor and the service director. Who else?
Well, let's see. This morning, Bob Engler, who owns ETE, was there. Vi Rothman, who's retired, was there. Harry Wyroth, who's retired, was there. Sam Ferreira, whose wife works for the school system, and he works for some kind of delivery service, was there. There was, let's see, who else came in?
Was it by invitation? You just come in and sit down?
No, you just come in and sit down. There's one table, and there's just, you'll remember this. Now, most people don't remember Kleckner's old restaurant.
Yes, I remember it very well.
Which was opposite where the Mike's is right now, across the street there. And they had a table in there called the Round Table, and this is pretty much what this same thing format is. The businessmen came in. When Kleckner's ended that tradition, or when it was ended, Wyris kind of became the round table for the city people, because they had that peculiar, you know, that U-shaped area, which was a holdover from Isley's stores, the old Isley stores. And that became pretty much where we all went and sat, and that's where it started. And then when Harry retired and sold the paper, sold the business, we stayed there for a while. But then when that guy went out of business abruptly, we wound up over at Mike's pretty much. Usually Pete Giacomo, the power superintendent, will stop in, and it varies. There's a number of attorneys. When I left there this morning, there were 4 attorneys sitting there. Joe Foreman, 3 attorneys, Forrest Thompson, Hal Bowers, and Joe Foreman, but Chuck Johnson usually joins it. So there's, it's kind of the meeting place of
where people will meet to eat.
Meet to eat and to talk.
And that's wonderful.
Discuss what's going on.
Then you leave Kleckner's,
Okay, then we go up to the main office, and
which is where right now?
The main office is right now on Route 18 in the shopping center where the Medina Antique Mall is, at the intersection of 71 and 18. It's probably not the most convenient place in the world for me to work, because I like to have a hands-on thing. I don't like to do stuff over the telephone. And so when I want to talk to somebody, I have to drive back down here. But I'll get there anywhere between 8:30 and 9 o'clock. Now, yesterday morning I was there at 6:45, and I skipped the breakfast table and ate up there because Tuesdays is the day we go out, and on Thursdays we go up to Cleveland for a meeting, so I have to be there early on Thursdays also. And my day then typically starts with looking over what's there on the desk to be done and doing it. I've still got a lot of writing to do. I don't just sit and edit somebody else's writing. A lot of times I don't see a lot of things until Tuesday morning and late Monday afternoon. I keep urging people to get copy into me earlier, but that doesn't always work out. And then if I need to do an interview, I have to drive back down here to do it. I will probably come back down here for the lunch period, because I'll stop at the high school. There are rounds that I make, which include the post office, the high school, and the junior high, and then occasionally Norton and high school and Norton Junior High. Although I've got somebody else that goes over and does that now. You can stop on the way to work doing that.
You stop by to pick up news?
I pick up stuff. We have a mailbox at the high school here. We also have a drop-off place at the Chamber of Commerce for people who want to drop stuff off there. I also have a mailbox of sorts at the junior high where I pick stuff up. And then the rest of the afternoon is basically typing, editing, rereading stuff, because you have to reread stuff 2 or 3 times. Unfortunately, on a computer screen you can miss
That's right.
typographical mistakes frequently. And putting heads on things, and then on Tuesday I physically have to lay out the paper. I'm lucky to get out of that office at 5:30. Generally, I'm not out of there much before 6 o'clock.
Okay, it's Friday afternoon. It's 5:30. You're done at the office. Now what do you do?
All right, on every other Friday, I go over for a meditation class to work off the week, but then the other Fridays, I'll probably go to a football game or some other sporting event to cover.
Heavily involved with the design.
Yeah, I still do a lot of that. I still make a lot of appearances, you know, the things you have to do, like go to the Chamber of Commerce luncheons and stuff like that. I go to the football games. Monday night, I was at a soccer game. Last night, I was at the volleyball game. Tonight, tomorrow, and the next night, I've got classes. So I won't be the rest of this week, but Saturday I'll probably be at a soccer game. It's more time consuming than people think. Now, a lot of the stuff at night isn't writing, but you need to be there for the job of being there and basically, you know, letting people in this town know that John put a slogan on this paper a long time ago, that we were the only paper in the whole wide world that called about Wadsworth and cared about Wadsworth.
That's right.
I still believe that. I can tell you that there are others who don't. You know, they don't simply because the business has changed, but it's still hopeful that we still care about what's going on in this city, and
when
as long as I'll be there, it will be.
When Sun took over, they took that off.
Right.
Do you know who got it back on?
You got it back on.
I got it back on. I thought that was one of the nicest things we ever had. Charlie, I'm going to talk about Charlie now.
Okay.
You've talked about Charlie, and boy, can you do it. You do a beautiful job, but I'm going to talk about Charlie. Charlie, you have the reputation in town, irrespective of the fact that you probably never hear the good things, but you have the reputation in town of having three criteria, or three attributes, which are excellent. And they probably are never ascribed to people in the newspaper business. First and foremost, you're extremely honest and detailed about facts. Doesn't care if the facts were against you, you would print them.
Yep.
That's one thing. Two, you are extremely intelligent and you can understand that which people should be saying, even though they can't say it the right way. And that's a skill, and you have a beautiful facility for being able to do that.
I appreciate that comment.
And the third one is one that you probably will never accept, but we'll say it for you, and that is that you have a feeling of compassion, sensitivity, and concern for people, which is far exceeding what we typically expect of newspaper people. Now, you know, and I know, that, you know, the second a child is killed, boom, they take a picture and put it in the paper. You don't do that kind of a thing. You always are more concerned about that. For this reason alone, if for no other reason, Charlie, you're going to go down in the Wadsworth history annals, or the annals of Wadsworth history, as being probably one of the most ethical and one of the most intelligent and one of the most compassionate newspaper people we have ever known. And you need to know that from us. You have been so giving of yourself to us, we're going to give that to you. And I would like to,
you're making me blush here.
I want you to blush, and I want you to blush. What I would like to do is have you be quiet for a couple of minutes so I can talk. The thing that we want Wadsworth to know, and we want the historians of Wadsworth to know, is the fact that you have those three criteria in addition to many other ones, but those are the three outstanding ones. The second thing is, and this is kind of a trick, Charlie, we have been asking people, or people have been asking me, are you, Caesar Carino, are you going to write the history of Wadsworth? The answer is no, I'm not going to write the history of Wadsworth. I am collecting data for the person who writes the history of Wadsworth. And some way along the line, we have tried to identify the people who could very well write the history of Wadsworth. The one person whose name surfaces more than anybody else's name is Charles Aukerman. A-U-K-E-R-M-A-N, so that you don't confuse that with any other spelling of Aukerman's, and so we know exactly what we're talking about. I would like to charge you with not the responsibility, but with the thought, or at least the germ of the thought, that you will someday, particularly within the next 2 or 3 years, because it's going to take 8 or 10 years to write a good history, to complement the three histories which have already been written, three major histories which have already been written about Wadsworth, for you to make an amalgamation of these for the year 2014, which is our 200th anniversary. Now, we don't expect you to make that commitment, but please know that the city of Wadsworth, in addition to thinking that you are one of the outstanding people, one of the most honest people, one of the most compassionate people, and one of the most intelligent people who could do this, we are saying, Charlie, will you?
Thank you. Thank you.
You're supposed
We'll
to say,
see.
yeah.
Oh, I'm supposed to tell you what I'll do.
Yes.
Well, I tell you, sir, Caesar, we'll do our best. I'm trying to preserve, as you probably well know, the files that are in our office right now, because there are many people in the company who don't feel that we need files like that they go back too far. You don't need history material.
We do.
Certainly, I'm going to see that before I leave there, that this stuff is turned over to the Historical Society, the people who would, really benefit. I'd like to see us get someplace that can store. The room in the library is very small, as you're aware, where the history materials are kept, and hopefully we can find some place. There is a possibility, of course, of using the former home of Dr. Johnson if it's moved from the site, that it's there at the moment.
We'd like to keep it right where it is.
Well, I know you would. I'm on the opposite side of that argument. But
Charlie, we have to stop because the tower is up. I want to thank you very much, and we certainly appreciate your being here, and you have indeed ingratiated us with your presence, but more important, you have given Wadsworth a dimension of history that only Charlie can give. Thank you very much, Charlie.
thank you very much, Sierra. I appreciate that.